Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Ray from the Bloomfield Public Library here in Connecticut. Thank you for joining us tonight for Urban Forests and Climate Change. Tonight's program is in partnership between the library, the Bloomfield Conservation, Energy and Environment Committee, and the Bloomfield Beautification Committee. I'm going to turn this over to Paula to tell us more.
Great. First of all, a big thank you to Sarah and to the Bloomfield Public Library for co-sponsoring this program as part of the Trees for Bloomfield initiative. I'm here with Ellen Castaldini. Ellen will be introducing our speaker shortly, but just a few words about this initiative. The Planning Committee consists of volunteers from the Conservation, Energy and Environment Committee, the Bloomfield Beautification Committee, and a handful of residents in Bloomfield who just love trees, which is great. We'll be offering additional programs and activities throughout the year to celebrate our trees and to increase awareness of all the benefits that they provide. Just right now, we've got a photo contest going for Bloomfield residents, so you can participate in that. That runs into the fall. There's also going to be a guided tree walk on September 25th, led by arborist John Kehoe. So in addition to planting more trees and having benefits further on in the fall, there's just a lot of activity going on. So if you'd like detail on any of these events, you'd like to help out, you'd like to make a donation to help plant trees in Bloomfield, the easiest way to get information is send an email to treesforbloomfield@gmail.com. treesforbloomfield@gmail.com. Also, keep an eye on the Bloomfield Messenger for stories about upcoming events. That's another way to be informed. And just to close out before handing off to Ellen, I really want to acknowledge John Karras, who is the editor of the Bloomfield Messenger and just a huge supporter of this initiative. He's been great. So without further ado, let me hand it off to Ellen to introduce our speaker.
Okay. So now we're heading towards our main event, Urban Forests and Climate Change. Our speaker is Danica Dorowski. Danica's well qualified to speak to us. She's a doctoral candidate at the Yale School of the Environment and is the State Urban Forestry Coordinator at Connecticut's Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. Danica's work focuses on restoration and management of planted and naturally regenerating urban forests. In this work, she draws from past experience in forestry as a Master of Forest Science student at Yale, public horticulture from her time at Morris Arboretum in Philadelphia, and community engagement from her work with the New York Restoration Project and the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation. We're all going to be muted while Danica goes through her presentation. And if you've got questions along the way, please type them in the chat, which you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window. Sarah, Paula, and I will be compiling your questions, and I think that Danica is going to say a little bit more about the chat. And at the end of the presentation, we'll be back to pose those questions to Danica. And now it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Danica.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I do have one request. I'm just requesting that if you don't mind, if you feel comfortable just popping in the chat the city or the town that you're tuning in from, that helps me bring back some information about the geographic spread of who this talk is reaching. So that would be helpful, and we'll address comments and questions at the end. So let me get right to it. As Ellen said, I am your urban forestry coordinator for the state of Connecticut. And I am also finishing up my doctorate at Yale School of the Environment. So urban forests and climate change are two topics I think about pretty much every day, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about what we can do about it. So a little overview of where we're headed. First thing I want to do in this talk, I want to set a baseline for what climate change impacts are and why we really care about these climate change impacts in our cities. You know, some of our cities are really going to feel these impacts really acutely, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about how urban forests can help slow climate change and counter the impacts, the negative impacts that we're seeing in cities. And then I'm going to temper everyone's expectations by explaining to you all why trees are not the ultimate climate change solution, because a lot of our trees and forests are going to be impacted by climate change themselves. So the final note, the note I'm going to leave you on is I'm going to discuss the ways that we can thoughtfully manage our urban forests so that they can be both a climate change tool, but that they'll be resilient and they'll be healthy in the wake of all of our climate change impacts. So there's a lot of nuance to these conversations, and I'm excited to share with you all what I've been thinking about and what some of the research is suggesting. So I'm not going to talk about the mechanisms behind climate change. Suffice to say, climate change is happening and it is real, and that human anthropogenic sources of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, are a major cause of the changes we're seeing. So you see here, we have seen CO2 levels fluctuate over time, but never have they been at the level that we're currently seeing. And this then causes the greenhouse gas effect, and that's where these gases built up in the atmosphere, they create this greenhouse effect that basically captures heat from the sun and keeps it there. So what we end up seeing are elevated temperatures. In addition to elevated temperatures, we're seeing a lot of other impacts that are coming with climate change. Longer growing seasons, we're seeing more droughts and more heat waves. We're seeing changes in precipitation patterns, which could mean more intense rain events or the absence of rain events. We're also seeing more intense and frequent storms, and then sea level rise. And in a lot of cities, we're feeling these climate change impacts even more intensely. So even though climate change is happening in our cities, it's happening at an accelerated pace because of the way our cities are set up. So a lot of you might be familiar with what's called the urban heat island effect. This is basically an effect that we observe because we have so much built environment and so much impervious surface in our cities that heat is absorbed and radiated at a different rate than it is in adjacent rural areas. And so what that translates to is temperatures up to 19 degrees hotter in cities like Hartford, for example, than nearby rural areas, and average summer days that are 2.5 degrees hotter than rural areas. And this is not just a comfort issue, this is a health issue. You know, people die in these kinds of heat waves, especially vulnerable populations that don't have access to air conditioners. And this is also an energy issue because it means if you do have an air conditioner, you're running it nonstop, and that's just contributing to our emissions and kind of creating this really negative feedback cycle. Now, another thing that we're observing with climate change is changes in precipitation patterns. And this is, again, something that we're feeling in our cities. And for those, you know, I live in New Haven, and we saw it just last week with, was it Elsa that came through and had massive flooding throughout our city. So the idea, you know, behind this is that, again, this impervious surface, this built environment is not designed to absorb stormwater. And so when it rains, the water has nowhere to go. And so it results in flooding, which is, you know, again, a human health issue. It's a property issue, but it's also a water quality issue because a lot of our cities, not just in Connecticut, but throughout the US, have what are called combined sewer systems. So that's this diagram here on the bottom right-hand side. What it means is that sewage from our household and you know, stormwater that comes in through our storm drains is all going into a single pipe. And under normal circumstances, that water is all going into a water treatment plant and getting cleaned before it gets pumped back out to our waterways. But anytime we get a significant rain event, or in some cases an insignificant rain event, any amount of rain, overwhelms that individual pipe so that we have raw sewage just going directly into our waterways. Okay, and I'm just going to touch on this quickly, but I think it's important to mention that, you know, these impacts are having negative consequences on urban dwellers everywhere, but this is especially being felt especially acutely amongst our vulnerable populations. There's a lot of stuff coming out in the news, a lot of research coming out that demonstrates that, you know, low income socio-demographic groups are experiencing the impacts of climate change even more acutely. And there's calls to really increase our urban tree canopy investments in these areas. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this. This is a presentation unto itself, but suffice to say that, you know, these are really real issues that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about the benefits of our urban population and the safety of our urban populations as a whole. So the good news is that urban trees can slow climate change and they can ameliorate climate change impacts in cities. One of the main ways they do this is by storing and sequestering carbon. So trees, as you probably know, as they photosynthesize, as they grow, they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They use it as sort of the building blocks and the energy for their growth. And so they're storing it in their trunks and their branches, and then they leave off oxygen. They give off oxygen. I want to distinguish between carbon sequestration and storage because I think they're often used interchangeably and they actually mean pretty different things. So carbon sequestration is the process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so species that are really effective at sequestering carbon are species that are really, really fast growing, right? Because the faster they're growing, the faster they're taking in that carbon. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those species that are sequestering carbon quickly are good at storing carbon. A lot of our species I pictured here, this is a cottonwood. If you're familiar with Eastern cottonwood, it's a fast growing, short-lived species. It sort of has this life cycle approach, grow fast, die young, right? Okay, so in its lifetime, it can sequester so much carbon, but as soon as it dies, it stops sequestering carbon. And if it's growing in a city, chances are when that tree dies, it's getting popped into a landfill and all that carbon is getting released back into the atmosphere. And this is in contrast to species that are much better carbon sinks or better at storing carbon. So here I have pictured a white oak. White oak is a slower growing species. It's longer lived. It's not going to be sequestering carbon at the same rate, but it's going to be storing so much carbon over its lifetime. And as a long-lived species, it's going to maintain that carbon for a longer period of time. So I want to highlight the differences between those. I think those are important distinctions to make, and I'm going to kind of refer back to this later in the presentation. And especially thinking about differences in tree species, this has a particular relevance when we talk about ameliorating urban heat island effect. So we know, climate change is resulting in higher temperatures. We know that cities already have higher temperatures. Urban trees can help to keep cities cool. And this is a map of the greater Bridgeport area. The map on the left is showing you surface temperature. So dark blue grids are showing you where we have really cool temperatures. Bright red are showing you where we have hot temperatures. And if you look at how that translates to the map on the right, that's canopy cover. You can see there's a pretty obvious connection between cooler temperatures and more canopy cover. Now, trees cool our cities with a couple different mechanisms. One way they do this is through evapotranspiration. This is the process of trees. They're constantly taking water up through their roots. As they pull it up through their vascular system, they're releasing that liquid, that water, through the pores in their leaves, which are called stomata. And that liquid is then being converted to a vapor. It's the same mechanism that we have in our window unit air conditioners. So that's one way they're cooling our atmosphere. The other way is shade. And I bring that up, and I talked about that difference between carbon storage, carbon sequestration, longer lived, shorter lived, large statured, small statured. Large statured, longer lived trees are much more effective at keeping our cities cool than smaller, faster growing species. I want to talk a little bit about the emerging research on urban heat island effect because it's really exciting. And I'm going to turn off my AC quickly, 1 second. Speaking of urban heat island effect, a little steamy here in New Haven. So the map I just showed you, so here's what's neat. So the map I just showed you, this is surface temperature, okay? You probably know though from walking down the street, you're gonna feel cooler air and you're going to feel hotter air just because of the way the wind blows, because of shade, because of the topography. And so researchers are now trying to gain a more nuanced understanding, not just of what this means on surface temperatures, but what this means for air temperature. So air temperature, the temperatures we're actually feeling as we're in our lived experience in cities. And the way they're doing this is by mounting weather stations onto bicycles and riding around cities and tracking the weather. And then they're taking that data back to their lab and they're looking at how that correlates with tree cover. So this is a researcher, Dr. Zitter, she's out of Concordia University. We have a researcher here in New Haven that did the same research project, and that research is soon to be published. And one thing that's really, really cool about this research is it highlights, it gives us some nuance as to how trees are really combating urban heat island. So what these researchers are finding is that it's not a linear relationship. In other words, it's not plant 1 tree, see 1 degree reduction, plant 2 trees, see 2 degrees reduction. What we need is we need a critical threshold of about 30 to 40% canopy cover before we see any real change in temperature. So this, I think, is an important finding, especially in the context of, how we're managing our cities and the fact that we need to be thinking not just at the single tree scale, but at the neighborhood scale, at the block scale, at the city scale, because ultimately it's those larger scale approaches that are going to translate to the differences that we want to see. So the other thing I mentioned was I showed you this graphic already on the right-hand side showing you that, we're going to see more flooding with climate change, that water has nowhere to go in cities. Trees are another great solution to that, excuse me, another great solution to these flooding and water quality issues. You can see in a city, there's nowhere for the water to go. When we have trees, the leaves are going to absorb water, but then the soil below can also absorb that water, and the roots of the trees can take that water up. And so we're seeing a lot less runoff than we would without any trees. Then here is, and this again is something that researchers are investigating, and they're trying to measure, right, exactly how much, what's the threshold, how much canopy cover do we need, how many trees do we need to actually see these differences. And so some of the research suggests that we need increasing canopy cover from 12 to 40% can decrease stormwater runoff by over 2.5%, and that urban trees can absorb 20 to 60% of precipitation. Again, 20 to 60% is a huge range, okay? And that's because different tree species function really differently on the landscape. So depending on what species of tree we're examining, whether they have really big open canopies, whether they're evergreen or deciduous, that's all going to have an impact on how these benefits translate to the tangible changes that we see on the ground. So, urban trees have way more benefits than the few I just alluded to, right? I just talked about urban heat island and I just talked about flooding, okay? But urban trees, they can increase property value, they can reduce driving speeds of people, on highways and on residential streets. They have so many other benefits, but the focus of this talk is really just climate change. So I'm not going to go into those other benefits. I'm just hopefully have made a case for you all about why there's this interest and investment in planting trees, right? Where there's so much interest in using trees as this climate change tool. And here I have this map from the Nature Conservancy. This is a tool that researchers developed called the Reforestation Hub, where they basically mapped out the whole US and they were looking for where can we plant trees? We want to plant trees for climate, for climate change. And they're looking for open space. What's really neat is in Connecticut, the second greatest potential for tree planting in our state is in open urban space. So unlike other places, if you look at the map from Montana, for example, they have all this open pasture land, and that's the bulk of where their tree planting would need to happen. In Connecticut, we're such an urbanized state that one of the greatest potentials for us to start planting more trees is in our cities. So now that I've gotten you all hyped up and excited about planting trees, I'm going to explain to you some of the things we have to think about when we're planting those trees, right? Because trees are only going to be effective in combating climate change if they're able to survive and grow in current and future conditions, okay? And I want to emphasize this because planting trees is incredibly carbon expensive. So think about the carbon, think about the energy that goes into taking a seed, growing a seed in a greenhouse, growing it on to be a sapling, bagging it up, getting a truck to haul those trees from wherever nursery they are to wherever they're going to get planted. You know, there's some carbon costs that come with planting trees. And so we need to be really thoughtful about what we're planting, where we're planting, and how we're planting so that we actually get the benefits that we're expecting. So going back to this climate change impact slide, I kind of want to walk through the impact that these different aspects of climate change are going to have on our urban canopy. So the first one, and I promised the folks before everyone got on the call that we were going to talk about storms and tree damage, because this is one of the issues that I hear about most often in my job. But we know that increased frequency and intensity of storms is a real consequence of climate change. And so we're going to see more and more storm damage. And this is a really significant issue because mature, large statured trees are the trees that are storing most of the carbon, right? I mentioned that difference before. The bigger trees, the longer lived trees, they're storing most of the carbon. They're providing most of the shade. They're taking up a lot of the water. So they're providing a lot of the benefits we see. And if those trees continue to get damaged or die due to storm events, then we're losing a significant amount of those benefits. The other real impact that trees are up against is these prolonged periods of drought. And I was speaking with some folks on the Tree Commission in Hartford. They were expressing to me how a few summers of drought, how a few seasons of drought have really had a negative impact on their trees. And this drought can kill trees, but drought can also keep trees alive, let trees live, but weaken them to the point that the first insect, pest, disease, whatever that comes through just knocks them right out. And so we're thinking about this in our rural forests and in our urban forests, but think about the growing conditions in our urban forests, right? We're already growing our trees in such droughty conditions. We're planting them in these teeny tree pits. We're planting them where the soil is already really compacted and it's that much harder for the tree roots to penetrate the soil and to access the water that's in these in these different little pockets. So our trees are already prone to drought. And so the drought that comes with climate change certainly will do no favors to our trees. I mentioned the fact that, once trees are drought stressed, they're more prone to pests and diseases. And the bad news is that with climate change, we're probably going to see a lot of pests and diseases become even more prolific. And here pictured is a hemlock tree with an invasive pest called hemlock woolly adelgid. Hemlock woolly adelgid can just wipe out hemlock trees. And the researchers in Connecticut have been tracking hemlock woolly adelgid, and what they found is that hemlock woolly adelgid can't exist in extreme cold snaps. So when we get those crazy cold winters that, a day or two of a polar vortex, a really cold winter, it kills off the hemlock woolly adelgid and keeps those populations at bay. But what they're finding is that we're not getting those cold snaps in the winter anymore. And so things like hemlock woolly adelgid don't really have the climate to help control them. And am I frozen? Am I frozen?
No, you're not.
Okay, good. Okay, wow, you all were just standing so still for a second there. You were just focused, okay. So what we're going to see these pests and diseases, some of them have natural climate controls that no longer are going to be controlling their populations. So just as we're going to see changes in the range of these pests and diseases, and we're going to see changes in the range of a lot of our native species. This is taken from the Climate Change Atlas. This is a tool developed by the U.S. Forest Service. It's really cool. I recommend anyone who's interested in this sort of thing to check it out. But what it shows you, it's showing you the range of sugar maple, for example, currently, and it's showing you the range of current maple in a future high climate change scenario. So what you can see, this scale here, this is species, this is an importance value. So the darker the color, the more important that species is. And what you can see is that sugar maple is a really important species currently in Connecticut, but that in the future, not so much. And that has implications for the ecology of Connecticut forests, and it also has a lot of economic implications. And sugar maple is not the only species that's expected to decrease with climate change. I should note there's also species that we're expecting to see migrate from the south north, but I'm not going to talk about that right yet. Okay, so the last climate change impact that I want to talk about that's going to have some serious consequences on our urban forests are invasive species. So we're going to see more carbon in the atmosphere. We're going to see changing climates, and a lot of invasive species that were restricted to the south we're going to see probably migrate north. And another thing we're probably going to see is, one thing about having more carbon in the atmosphere means that allows plants in a lot of senses to grow faster, because they take carbon in, they produce oxygen. It's one of the elements that they use for their growth and for their respiration. And so the species that grow the fastest are going to be able to exploit this increased carbon level in the atmosphere the most readily. And often those are our invasive species. So here in the background, you can see Porcelain Berry. This is an invasive vine, and it's growing up into canopy trees. These vines can strangle trees. They can take mature trees down, and they also can limit regeneration in the understory. So that's a thick mat, and you can imagine we're not going to see too many little tree seedlings popping up underneath there. So, now to the more optimistic portion of the talk, which is what can we, knowing what we know about how effective trees are against climate change, but also knowing how they're going to be impacted by climate change, how can we manage our urban forests to combat climate change and its impacts and still be resilient? So a few recommendations and thoughts here. I think one of the most important things we can do is to start investing and maintaining trees throughout our life cycle. And I'm saying this, ignoring the fact that I know that there's time, budget, personnel restrictions that limit us from doing it, but it's something you can do with your household trees, right? There's a lot of research that shows that structural and preventative pruning throughout a tree's life cycle can make it more wind firm, which means when a hurricane comes through or when strong winds are coming through, that tree's less likely to get damaged or to die. And even things as simple as watering your trees. Newly planted trees always should be watered, but watering trees and helping reduce some of that drought stress is one way we can make sure that our trees are healthiest and most resilient to these different impacts. Now, thinking about the full life cycle of a tree doesn't just mean about thinking about a tree while it's alive. We also have to think about what's happening to the tree after it dies. So when a tree dies in a forest, usually it just is left there and it decomposes slowly, and the carbon is then released back into the atmosphere gradually. When a tree dies in an urban area, usually your public works director has to go out, or your tree warden or whomever has to go out, haul the tree out, and it ends up getting either chipped or landfilled, and that carbon is just released right back into the atmosphere. This image here is an urban wood utilization program that's being trialed right now in Hartford in Keeney Park by the Keeney Park Sustainability Group. And what you can see here is they have brought a sawmill into the park, and they're taking trees that were taken down throughout the city, and they're milling them and creating lumber. And so the carbon that was stored in the live tree is the carbon that's stored in the dead tree, that's stored in the lumber, that's stored in whatever furniture or end of use product goes into that. So that's one way we can keep carbon in wood and in lumber instead of releasing it back out into the atmosphere. Another way is to, when we are planting species, thinking about the beginning of the life cycle, deciding which species to plant, is to be thinking really specifically about diversity. And this is something we think about a lot because we've seen what overplanting individual species can do. A lot of you, I'm sure, have witnessed, the American elms being decimated by Dutch elm disease. And here I have a picture of a beautiful ash-lined street, pre-emerald ash borer, and then after emerald ash borer, which is an invasive pest, came through. So when we are not planting diverse species, we make ourselves really vulnerable to pests. But planting diverse species is also a really great way to hedge our bets against climate change, right? Because we don't know exactly which species are going to do well and which species aren't going to do well in future climate change scenarios. We have some models that we've developed to help us understand, but these are still very unpredictable and very uncertain. So when we're planting a diversity of different species, this really helps us ensure that whatever happens, we at least planted, some species that are going to do well. And so I'm going to highlight a little research that I did myself. This is part of my dissertation research. This is results from a survey that I sent out to cities throughout the northeastern US. You can see each green point is representing a city that I reached out to. And I basically sent them a survey to understand what species of trees they planted over the past 5 years. And the premise of this research was kind of to understand, what does diversity look in an individual city, but what does diversity look like in an entire region? Because though we often think about diversity, for example, in New Haven, we're really thoughtful about maintaining diversity in New Haven. We in New Haven aren't necessarily talking to Hamden, and Hamden isn't necessarily talking to Meriden about what tree species they're planting. And so if we're all planting the same species in our own cities, that when we scale up, we're still losing diversity. And so what you can see here, this is the results of this study. This shows you, unfortunately, these are Latin names, but I added these little symbols for cherry, maple, oak, and legumes that hopefully will give you an indicator of what species are in these. This is showing you how many trees over the past 5 years were planted in the Northeast in these 4 different families. So half of all the trees planted were in these 4 different families, and you can see cherries are one of the families. The cherry family is one of the families that we're planting most abundantly. I'll also note that this is color coded by nativity. So the peach color are non-native species, blue is native, orange is hybrid, and then green is native to North America. But I want to introduce another term while we're talking about diversity, because we want to plant diversity in terms of, we want to plant lots of different types of species, but we also want to plant lots of species that can do the same thing within a specific function. And this is what's called functional redundancy. So functional redundancy means, again, I gave you that example of those different types of tree species, the the fast growing short-lived species versus the long-lived slow growing species, shade trees versus ornamental trees. Maintaining functional redundancy means that we're planting lots of different species within a particular function. So this graph is showing just shade trees. So having high functional redundancy here would mean that we are planting lots of different shade tree species. And the thought process behind that is, if one species doesn't do well, we at least know that we're not going to lose that species along with that whole function, right? We're not going to lose all of our oaks and lose all of our shade canopy at the same time. So this graph is showing you that same data set, and it's showing you just looking at shade trees. So almost a quarter of all the shade trees that we plant are oak species, which I think is actually pretty concerning, knowing that oaks have issues with oak wilt and with gypsy moth. We run the risk of losing almost a quarter of our shade tree canopy, which again has impacts for things like urban heat island effect. This is the same idea as showing you for ornamental trees. You can see that 40% of ornamental trees are either tree lilacs or are cherries. Okay, I'm getting to my last few slides now, and I just want to, these last few slides are talking more about diversity and how we can select, think about planting different types of species, but we also can think about, using the information we have to favor the species that are predicted to do well. So this is again from the U.S. Forest Service, from their climate atlas, that just kind of shows different native species and how they're expected to do well in future climate situations. So things like red maple that are highly adaptable are predicted to fare much better. And so testing out these species adaptations is something that's already happening in Connecticut. Some of you might have seen this article in the Connecticut Mirror. This is highlighting the work of one land conservancy out in Stonington. They're testing out some species that are some management techniques for climate change, including planting species that are from southern provinces north of their range. So for example, they took species, native species from Maryland, and they're planting them here in Connecticut to see if those southern adapted species can do okay up here in the Northeast. And it's a form of what we call assisted migration. So basically kind of knowing that we're going to see some different climate changes, how can we facilitate the movement of the species that will do well? So last note that I'll leave you all, the last kind of management tip that I want to leave you all on, and again, this ties in very intimately to my own research, is the value of investing in forested natural areas. This is a map of the city of New Haven. Each colored polygon is a forest in the city. This is an example of a forest. This is my field assistant from a couple years ago in this forest. These are spaces we forget about all the time, okay? These are places like Keeney Park in Hartford that are incredibly valuable from a climate change perspective, but they're jeopardized and they're threatened by things like invasive species. And so here's a graph that's just a study that's showing you in New York City carbon storage in natural areas versus in street trees. So this is from New York City. And what they're finding is that 70% of carbon stored is stored in parks, in forested natural areas in New York City, not in street trees. So these natural areas are a really valuable tool that we have in the wake of climate change. But we need to be working to promote their growth. And these are some images, again, from my own fieldwork. You can see there's some great little oak seedlings that are growing in here, but we've got some black locust kind of crowding it out. This is a situation where we don't even have to plant trees. An investment in the form of removing some of that black locust could be a really effective way for us to ensure the future resilience and health of that forest. So I hope I didn't completely overwhelm you all. I hope you're leaving with the take home that climate change and urbanization are inevitable, that urban trees and forests are this incredible tool that we have to ameliorate the negative impacts of urbanization and of climate change, but that this potential is not a given. This is going to hinge on really thoughtful urban forest management. And I think learning how to effectively manage these forests is to the benefit of our urban forests, but also to the benefit of our rural forests as well, as we see a lot of the conditions that we're witnessing in urban areas expand outwards into more rural areas of the state. So these are things I'm very, very passionate about. I'm always happy to continue conversations. Hopefully there's some questions. And I also hope, you know, if you don't have a question or you think of something later, that you please take my contact information and reach out to me later. I'd love to hear from you all. So thank you for listening.
Well, terrific. That was wonderful, Danica, and thank you. We have one question in the chat right now, and maybe we can talk a little bit about whether we want to just open it up and let people ask questions. But I will read Nancy's question from the chat. I know people tend to shy away or run away from bamboo, but is there value in managed bamboo? Grows quickly, may be good at sequestration, and then if harvested in sustainable ways can be used for many products and as a replacement for plastic. So it may not meet the same end of live issue of re-releasing carbon. So any comments on bamboo?
Yeah, good question. I think about these things a lot. Something like, you know, I am not an expert on bamboo. And so I think that you also have to think about the way that some of these species maybe change soil conditions, change other conditions in ways that could have really detrimental impacts. So not just thinking about beyond just the carbon storage potential. But I will say, you know, I'm not as knowledgeable about bamboo, but for example, a species like black locust, that's a species that's native to southeastern US. It falls in that category of fast growing, short-lived species. It's considered an invasive throughout most of the Northeast. People actively remove it. I personally feel that in certain situations, it's a good thing to have. It's sequestering a lot of carbon. And so I think that there are certainly in urban areas, there's opportunities to be a little bit flexible about our thinking of what our end management goal really is. I certainly would never promote for planting locust in a big intact park where we have lots of native trees and where, you know, that locust could potentially change the soils, could outcompete a lot of our native species. But for example, in a vacant lot, in New Haven, for example, there's lots of vacant lots that have lots of black locusts growing, and I think it's providing some really valuable ecosystem services.
And if I may follow on with one quick question about black locust before reading the next question. Has there been any kind of has there been migration of black locust? Because that's something I've wondered about, you know, what trees are, you know, what plants are invasive and what plants have gotten here on their own?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think it's such a hard one to answer. But I mean, like for the black locust example, it's like, we know species are going to migrate with climate change. There's no reason that black locust is not, it's native to the southeastern US. It's already native to this continent. And so I think it's, you know, it's going to be part of our ecology in the future. It just is. And so my thought process is like knowing that, you know, knowing that it's sort of inevitable, does it really make sense to remove it and to treat it as an invasive? And that ties into, I think, some like bigger picture conversations about when we restore urban areas, what's our reference point? Like, what are we trying to get back to? Are we trying to get back to pre-colonization, you know, vegetation? Are we trying to get back to 50 years? Are we just trying to get native dominated? And there's no right answer. I think it really depends on the context of the space. But for me personally, I'm the wrong person to ask because I love black locust and I think it's a cool species. But, you know, I think in those situations, it's helpful for us to think about what role is it playing southeast of here, and how can we harness that information to effectively manage it here? That's not just removing it outright.
Great, thank you. One question: how can the positive benefits from city trees be increased?
I mean, so many ways. I think so many ways. I think. Being really thoughtful about species composition is really important. You know, one thing that is a little disconcerting with this, you know, fervor behind planting trees is that there's not always as much consideration about what actual species we're planting. But the reality is that, you know, certain species just provide more benefits than other species do. And so I think that we can leverage our understanding of those different benefits to promote, you know, for example, larger statured trees, while they're problematic under power lines, provide a lot more services than smaller statured trees. And so it depends what benefit you're talking about specifically, I suppose. Like if you're thinking about community engagement and outreach, sometimes smaller statured trees are a better way or provide more benefit in that regard. So I suppose that's a hard question to answer because benefits can be so diverse. And so it really depends on what benefits specifically you're talking about. But I would say one thing that is certain is that stewarding and caring for and maintaining trees is the best possible way to maximize the benefits of any urban tree canopy.
Great, thank you. One question I thought of when you were talking about the research that now is being done as far as tree cover and air temperature. And I think you said maybe it was being done in New Haven.
Yeah.
Is that going to be expanded to other cities potentially, or can the results from a single city be extrapolated to other urban areas?
Yeah, I think that I think both. I think that they probably can be extrapolated. And one of the reasons I'm excited about the project in New Haven is that, I've been doing my dissertation research in New Haven, and I've really been trying to promote New Haven and some of Connecticut's cities as what we would call average US cities, right? So much of the research happens in New York City and in Philadelphia and in these really big sort of like megalopolis cities. But in reality, the structure, the way land is distributed, the amount of impervious surface is really different in a New Haven versus a New York City. And so I think like New Haven compared with Hartford, I think that a lot of those results are probably transferable, or, New Haven compared with, another small city. But I will say that as the technologies are evolving around that particular form of analysis, I would expect to see more research being done just in general, because they're pretty complicated analyses, and we're just at the start of understanding those relationships with air temperature. So I think it's probably going to expand, but I think certainly results from New Haven could translate to another city of that size or of that sort of landscape structure.
Okay, great. And we got a follow-on question from Jean regarding the positive benefits of city trees. She was thinking specifically about climate change. So can you address it with respect to climate change? So how can the positive benefits from city trees be increased from the perspective of climate change?
And talking about climate change just as carbon storage. So not thinking about climate change from like climate change, all these different climate change impacts, but thinking just about like, we want to reduce the amount of CO2 that is in the atmosphere.
Start there, and then I'll ask a question about stormwater.
Yeah. Okay. So starting with just removing the amount of CO2, again, I'm going to go back to these forested natural areas as like such a unexploited opportunity for carbon sequestration and storage. These forested natural areas in cities, these are places where we don't even necessarily have to plant trees a lot of the time. There's already tree seedlings that are regenerating. So they're sort of unlike street trees where you plant a tree, it dies, you remove it, you plant a new tree. In a lot of these parks and natural areas, we already have that regeneration. So that kind of takes the carbon cost of tree planting out of the equation. And carbon is not just stored in trees, okay? It's stored in soil, it's stored in roots, it's stored below ground. And in fact, there's a lot of research that suggests that the carbon storage potential of soil actually surpasses the storage in some situations in above ground vegetation. So again, with that regard, investing in our parks, it's not just about the above ground vegetation. We just have more soil there. Like we have more carbon storage potential in these particular spaces. So I would say that really, I would advocate for more investment in those spaces in our cities. And then as a second tier, when we're thinking specifically about street trees, I think, yes, we want to be planting these longer lived trees if ultimately carbon storage is the goal. We need trees that are going to be, in it for the long haul.
Okay. How about street trees? I mean, in terms of street trees and what you just talked about versus more of the parks.
Well, for street trees, again, I think to whatever extent we can be planting large statured, long-lived trees, they're just storing more carbon than things like our ornamental cherries. That's just simply a fact. I think, so that's not always an option in cities, right? Like we have power lines and that's a huge, huge struggle. That's something that we're, dealing with on a daily basis, right? Is how to manage these multiple land management objectives. But I think wherever possible, wherever there's an opportunity to plant a large statured shade tree, I would promote it.
Okay. So one quick follow-up about stormwater, and then I have a question from Jack. The stormwater question, I'm thinking about Hartford, and I'm thinking about this huge project that the Metropolitan District Commission is involved with around CSOs and building this large storage tunnel to, sort of help manage the stormwater from massive storms. I'm imagining there's some problems now with all the rain we've been having. Can you comment on that? And then related to that, one of your slides talked about or mentioned a statistic about increasing the canopy by a certain percentage helped mitigate runoff by something like I think it was 2.6%. And is 2.6% a lot? A lot, because it seems like a small number.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so the first question, I feel like I am not familiar enough with the project to comment. So I want to stay in my wheelhouse because I don't actually know enough about that project. But 2.6%, I mean, yeah, no, it's a great question. Like, is that really significant? And I think when I read that paper, I had the same question. And I think I'm not an expert on bioswales or engineered tree pits, but I think that's where those sorts of green infrastructure come in. You know, this talk, I was really focused on urban trees as a climate change tool, but I think that we have a whole suite of different green infrastructure tools that we can be using. And so bioswales are a huge one for stormwater capture. Engineered tree pits, where we're using, you know, some mixtures of artificial substrate that are even better at absorbing water, I'm sure would only change those values. So trees alone maybe aren't doing, you know, aren't changing a massive amount, but I think that there's ways we can use technologies to promote and enhance that.
Okay, great, thank you. And let's see, I'm going to mute myself for. Sorry about that, I had some background noise. A question from Jack, and then Meredith may have a question. Jack's question was, please talk about the potential for planting trees on private property.
Oh, yeah, excellent point. And, you know, that's something I really didn't even address in this talk. I've been in my role as Urban Forestry Coordinator, you know, I'm focused so much on public lands, but tree planting on private property is a huge potential for increasing urban tree canopy cover, and particularly in areas where we don't have tree pits, right? There's a lot of cities. I've been doing a lot of work in Waterbury, which again, I'm new in my role, so I'm still learning the geography of these different cities, but walking around Waterbury is really stark because there's no tree pits at all. So I think that planting trees on private property is a pretty valuable resource. And I think trees on private property tend to also have better long-term outcomes because they're being planted by a resident who really wants them. And so the stewardship piece is also there because that's a big piece to the long-term success. So I don't have any statistics or facts about what the potential is for planting on private property. I'd be curious actually to know what that is. But I think that promoting residential tree planting programs can be really valuable. I worked in my prior work, I worked in New York City, and we did a lot of tree giveaway programs. So giving away free trees to residents. And I have some mixed feelings about that as a tool for increasing canopy cover. I think it's a great idea. I think sometimes the trees don't get planted properly. And again, then there's like that carbon cost that doesn't actually end up paying off. So I think that when it's happening, it needs to be really thoughtfully executed so that the trees are planted correctly and then they're stewarded and maintained throughout their life.
Great, thank you. And Meredith is unmuted. So Meredith, would you like to ask the question directly or would you like me to read it?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I had some questions related to the fungi on the trees, their presence, and does climate change and pH balance of the soil impact the increase of fungi, and what are the long-term effects of fungi on the trees?
That is a great question that I'm gonna have to say I don't know how climate change is going to change those fungi. You're talking about like
fungi, yes,
fruiting bodies on trees.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. And I mean, usually when you see a fruiting body on a tree, that means that there's rot. and rot means that that tree is dying or declining. And so usually that's kind of a telltale sign for an arborist to get in and take care of it. I would have to think about, what that would look like. So I'll get back to you.
Great.
Thank you.
Jack had a follow-up comment just about private property. In Hartford, 50% of our canopy is on private property. I suspect in Bloomfield and other suburban towns, the potential is much higher because house lots are much larger.
Yeah, so I think that it would be so interesting, and I think probably talks like this are so valuable from that perspective to spread the word and start these conversations about how important trees are, and to encourage homeowners to think about the trees that are on their property, and then to think about, if they're interested in planting a tree, what types of species of trees they should be planting, and to steer people, in the right direction, so they're not just going to Home Depot and picking out whatever like fruiting cherry looks nicest, but have some education and outreach so that private homeowners can think a little bit more about how their individual tree canopy is actually contributing to the city of Bloomfield's urban canopy and the state of Connecticut's canopy, right? To encourage people to think outside of their own backyards and about much more big picture contribution.
Great. Does anybody else have a question? I think I have one just sort of related comment related to the Trees for Bloomfield initiative. Sharon Mann is on as well. I'll mention her by name because she's the chair of our beautification committee, and the beautification committee has largely taken the lead in determining what kinds of trees to plant. And the things that you're talking about as far as being thoughtful about picking larger trees for appropriate spaces, but being more concerned about the appropriate size of street trees, with power lines and that kind of thing. Natives versus, trees that can withstand being mowed around and so on and so forth. Those things are going into the all of the consideration. But I think trees, I think Jack's question and comment is really good in terms of thinking about how to go beyond planting trees on private land or public land in Bloomfield, and trying to expand the opportunity and maybe make things more available for private property as well. So thank you. Thank you.
And I'll just share, if this is useful for anyone on this call, that I recently had a conversation with a nonprofit out of Boston that is working with schools. They're looking to actively, they want to do more outreach in Connecticut schools, and they basically partner with a school. They provide free trees. And the expectation then is that the school or students at the school do outreach in order to, have residents basically adopt these trees, plant them in their backyard. They help the people plant them. So it's kind of a program to get free trees, but there's an education and an outreach component embedded in it. So I'd be happy to share their contact. They have been doing work throughout the Northeast. They really want to work with more schools in Connecticut. They asked me if I knew of any, and I was like in my role for a month. So I didn't know, but I'm sharing that because it sounds like it could be of interest to some folks on this call.
Yeah. Yes, please share that with us.
Yeah.
Very good.
A comment from Ruth. Placement of trees on property also impacts its utility for reducing energy. And I'm assuming energy use maybe?
Yeah.
And then Sharon made the comment directed to everybody that our next tree planting is going to be the first day of autumn in September. So watch for news about that.
Excellent. Great.
All right. Other questions? Oh, Sunny, take yourself off mute. Can you do that? Yeah.
Okay. I just thought of something. You mentioned something about deciduous trees and evergreen trees. Is there a difference in their ability to store the carbon? Is one better than the other?
Good question. I would go back to the research before I gave you a definitive answer. My thought, just like thinking off the top of my head, is like, so the difference between deciduous and evergreen trees, right, is their growth cycle. So deciduous trees are going dormant in the winter time, so they're stopping growing. Whereas evergreens are going to continue to grow throughout the season. So my inclination, my thought would be, you know, maybe those evergreen trees are continuing to sequester and store carbon throughout the year, where deciduous trees are stopping. But I would certainly want to check the research before I said anything for certain. Evergreen trees are sort of interesting. I think we don't tend to plant them very often, but have, I think, quite a bit of utility in terms of diversifying our tree palettes. Also, the fact that they hang on to their needles year round, they can be helpful for like things like water filtration and stuff like that. So it's a good question, a good thing to think about.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else with a question? Going once? Going twice? All right. Well, thank you very much, Danica. This has been wonderful. And we'll have the recording available eventually, which is great. People can share it and use it.
Yeah.